I'm going to call this meeting to order. Today is the Finance and Audit Committee special meeting, Wednesday, 24th. This is do we have give the public the opportunity to discuss any matters of public interest within the committee scope, including items on or not on the agenda?
There are no speakers this evening.
We have one consent item that I need a motion.
I move we approve the consent agenda.
I second.
I have a motion and a second. Director Orzali
Aye.
and Director Sheets.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, at this time, we have one action summary minutes, recommendation and approval of the action. Oh, we just did that, sorry. We have one presentation item. I'll call Amanda.
Good evening, directors, Chief Harms. This evening, we will be presenting the preliminary budget for fiscal year 2017-18, which is the 12 months beginning July 1, 2017. This is being presented to the committee this evening in advance of presentation to the full Board of Directors for adoption at the board meeting on June 8th. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Chief Harms, who I think wanted to make a couple of comments at the outset.
Thank you. Good evening to both of you. I just have a few things about the budget. Director Sheets, I know that you came to one of our initial budget meetings. Through the preliminary budget, we started off with quite a large funding gap. We went through the cycle and gave the opportunity for each of our different divisions to come forward with funding needs. We went through that process, prioritized our spending, and presently this evening, I would say that we have essentially a balanced budget with a one-time expense. The 17-18 budget roughly includes about $195 million in revenue and about $196 million in expenses. And that's a $1 million use of revenues, and it's mostly as a one-time expense, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's for the downstairs rental of the downstairs and renovations of that area. Property tax revenue for 17-18 is expected to be up about 5%. That's about 1% higher than Amanda had expected initially. And we do see some additional revenue and some additional funding through basically ambulance reimbursement or our medical fees. There is some that goes in there. Of the growth of the large portion of it is the growth of the budget goes with the labor and the expenses from salaries under the contract and some higher pension costs. As I said, the budget assumes a one-time first floor that we would lease that in 2017-18, where again we're working with two parties right now. And we would use approximately $1 million out of the reserve funds for upgrades to the first floor with that new occupant coming in. We're going to talk a lot tonight about the budget, and then tomorrow night Amanda's going to go through and look at a 5-year prediction of kind of where we're at today, some basic expectations or some assumptions on future growth, and also some future expectations as far as pensions and costs and some additional expenses that we'll have coming forward. So tonight we'll mostly focus on the 17 and 18 budget.
Could you just talk briefly about that $1 million delta that we're going to experience in this budget? How do you see that coming back in terms of revenue?
So in terms of revenue, we'll look at a lease. Right now they're looking at between a 5 and a 7-year lease. One of the places that we're looking at is looking at a 7-year lease with 2 5-year extensions. And over the terms of that lease, we would take that money and recoup that money as that investment back into that first floor. It actually is probably somewhere between $1.5 and $1.7 million in tenant improvements. And then over that lease, we would recover that money back into it with that extension or options of a 5-year. We also have the options, hopefully, that will be built into it, that if there was a reason we wanted them because of expansions of the district or other reasons that we came forward, is how do we move them out? And what would that look like too on the other side of it? I'll have to say that initially, that amount of money it was more than what I expected as an investment to bring someone in, and how do we recover that? After sitting down with Jeff Fry and going through where the market is today, what expectations are, the commercial leasing, and it is pretty common for the owners to provide that as an incentive for tenants to come in, and you recoup that money over that 5-year lease or that 7-year lease during that time. But again, that was more than I expected. The struggle that I have is that while I don't like being a landlord, it's kind of where we're at right now, and the loss of that revenue would have an impact onto the budget. While we could use the space, we could not use that additional money to fund operational needs that we have each and every day out there. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a tough place for us to be in right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
Amanda?
Okay, so let's kind of jump in a little bit, and I like to sort of start these presentations by kind of looking at the history of general fund revenues for the district. So this chart probably looks familiar to you. It's been included in past budget presentations, but essentially the dark blue portion is showing property tax revenues, and then the light blue portion is all other revenue sources. And you can see, in the 2008-9 timeframe where we experienced the dip in revenues due to the economic recession, and then the recovery that has occurred since then. Most recently, in fiscal year 2016-17, that was the first year where our property tax revenues really reached their pre-recession levels. So it took that long of a period of time to recover back to the same level of property tax revenues. But you can see, because of development of other revenue sources, primarily in medic fees and some of the supplemental programs like GEMT and IGT, that our other revenues sort of helped to make up for that difference in that recovery period. And in terms of total revenues, we were able to recover sooner than we would have had we been relying solely on property tax revenues. Looking at 2016-17, we this year expect property tax revenues of $131 million, and then you can see, as Chief Harms mentioned, when we look forward to next fiscal year 17-18 budget, we're projecting property taxes of about $138 million. So that's a $7 million, about a 5% increase in property tax revenues. That's a higher percentage increase than we've seen in each of the last 2 years. So I think that helps from a funding standpoint to have that additional revenue available in 17-18. Looking at total revenues for 17-18, when we add the other revenue sources together, and also when we add in our net intergovernmental transfer, or IGT revenue, we're at $195 million for 17-18, which, if you kind of look back to where we were sort of at the depths of the recession, in 2010-11 timeframe, $144 million, or about $50 million more in total revenue. So this table is really showing us, for the proposed 17-18 preliminary budget, all of the district funds that would have budgeted expenditures. Most of my presentation is going to focus on the general fund. That's where most of our activity is, all of our operating expenditures in there. But I do want you to see all of the funds that we have a budget for. We will talk a little bit more in detail about the capital facilities fund, the lease properties fund, and the grants fund as well. The Development Impact Fees Fund, I just want to mention, is a revenue source related to new development. So that's when developers are issued permits, they pay a fee, and then that fee revenue can only be used by us to either build or equip new fire stations that are needed to serve that new development. So it's really a restricted revenue source, can only be used for those capital expenditures that are related to new development. So we expect to continue to generate revenue in that fund, but not have a lot of expenditures because we don't anticipate any expenditures related to new fire stations or equipment for new fire stations in 17-18. And then the last fund there is the IGT fund, or the Intergovernmental Transfer Fund. We account for all of the activity of those intergovernmental transfers separately in this fund, just to provide some more transparency. How that works is that we need to send money out to the state, and then a portion of that is retained by the state as an administrative fee. The remainder is used as matching funds for federal funds that are coming back in and ultimately get paid to us through the HMOs that have Medi-Cal beneficiaries. So what's happening in 17-18 is that instead of normally the 1 year's worth of participation in this program that we would have, there are 2 years that we anticipate are actually going to be covered in 17-18. So that would cover activity for fiscal years 15-16 and 16-17. Normally, we would only expect to have that 15-16 activity covered in 17-18, and then we would expect the 16-17 activity to be covered in 18-19 and provide revenue in that fiscal year. So the way that we're showing this from a budget standpoint is all of that IGT activity would happen in 17-18, but we would only transfer back out to the general fund for use in 17-18, 1 year's worth, and then that second year would remain in the IGT fund so that it could be available for general fund expenditures in 18-19. It's a little bit complicated, but if you look at the numbers on there, the key numbers are the revenues less expenditures line of approximately $11.5 million. That's the total net IGT revenue that we would be getting in 17-18. And we're saying that $5.7 million of that would go to the general fund, and roughly the same amount would remain in the IGT fund for use in 18-19. So in each of 17-18 and 18-19, we would have about $5.7 million in IGT funding that would go to the general fund and be available for general fund operating expenditures. One thing that I think might help to clarify all of the numbers on this is a lot of times people look at that total revenue number all the way up to the right of $227 million and think that that's the amount that's available to fund the district's operating expenditures. In reality, it's really the two numbers that are circled on this chart. So it's our general fund revenue, and then it's that same $5.7 million transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund that are available for general fund operating expenditures. The revenues that show up in these other funds really are only available to fund the expenditures in those funds. So they're either restricted in their use or they're required for the expenditures in those funds. So it's the sum of those two circled numbers, which is about $195 million that's available to fund general fund expenditures. And then looking at that $195 million and comparing it to what we expect those expenditures to be in 17-18 is what gets us to either a surplus or a deficit position in the general fund, so to where we're either adding to or taking away from reserves. And what this budget is reflecting is that we would be using approximately $1.2 million in general fund reserves, partially for the reasons that Chief Harms mentioned earlier, and I will talk about in more detail. But what that means is that we're starting with a general fund reserve balance of $21,440,000. We're taking out of that $1.2 million and then projecting to end the year with a general fund reserve of $20,192,000, rounding up there. So that's kind of the mechanics of how everything works on this chart. Looking a little bit more closely at the general fund and what the changes are from this current year to the budget year 17-18. Looking first at the revenue line, you can see that we're going from general fund revenues of $182 million in 16-17 to almost $189 million in 17-18. And we'll talk about the detail behind that and what some of those changes are in a couple of slides. Looking at the expenditures line, total expenditures going from expenditures in the general fund of just under $184 million to just under $192 million in 17-18. Again, we'll talk about the details there. And then we also have to look at the transfers that are coming in and out because that impacts the bottom line number. So we need our general fund revenues and our expenses, and then also to look at those transfers to figure out what the net impact is to the general fund. So the transfers that are occurring in 17-18 show up in that middle column, the preliminary budget column. We have a transfer that's going out to the capital facilities fund of about $3.5 million, and that's funding debt service that we pay out of that fund. So that's essentially our debt related to prior year capital purchases that we borrowed money to pay for. And then, in addition to that, any new capital purchases that are occurring in 17-18, and I'll talk about the details behind that. Then we also have a transfer that's going out to the leased properties fund. So that's a little under $700,000 that's going to the leased properties fund, and that is being driven by the fact that we do have this, we're anticipating that we would have a large one-time expense in 17-18 as a result of leasing out the first floor of this building that we would recover the cost of over the life of the lease. So I do want to stress, and I'll talk about it as we get there in more detail, that these are all based on assumptions. So it's an assumption about how much revenue would be generated and what the associated tenant improvement and cost with that rental rate would be. There are trade-offs, so it could end up being a lower rental rate and a lower tenant improvement costs, or the reverse. But we've made an assumption that at this point seems reasonable about what's most likely to happen on the first floor. And then the final transfer is what we already talked about. That's that transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund, about $5.7 million, and that's helping to provide additional resources in the general fund, so that when you compare the revenues and expenses and transfers, you end up with a $1.2 million use of general fund reserves. That compares to about $700,000 in the current 16-17 budget. So you can see that that basically an additional, compared to this year, it would be an additional use of reserves of $500,000, which is actually less than that transfer amount that's going to the leased properties fund as a result of those one-time expenses. So turning to look at a little more at general fund revenues, I mentioned that total general fund revenues, and this is excluding IGT because that's happening in a different fund, but total revenues in the general fund are $189 million for the 17-18 budget. You can see that the vast majority of that, almost 73%, is coming from property taxes. The next largest category is our medic cost recovery. That's a little under 20%. And then we have additional amounts coming from the other categories that you see there. So that $189 million general fund revenue budget represents about a $6.7 million increase in revenues compared to the current fiscal year 16-17 budget. Property taxes are representing about $6.8 million of that increase. So that 5% increase we're expecting in property taxes is generating an additional $6.8 million. We're also including $3.1 million in additional revenues for medic cost recovery, and this is really resulting from two factors. One is essentially having additional units in service for which the district is billing relative to 16-17. So we're comparing a full year 17-18 to a 16-17 year where there were AMR units operating in the district that we were not billing for. So we expect to see an improvement as a result of that. And then we are also assuming that there would be an adjustment to the rates during the 17-18 year. The rates haven't been adjusted since 2012, and our costs have certainly gone up since then. So that's something that we're evaluating right now, is an adjustment to rates that would be brought forward to the board for consideration, and would result in additional revenues in 17-18. We have about $400,000 increased revenue as a result of contract service, and this really results from additional cost recovery that we would expect for the service that we're providing, the ARF service that we're providing at McClellan under a contract that's being negotiated there. And then offsetting those increases We have $3.8 million reduction in revenue because we're comparing mid-year budget in 16-17 that includes reimbursement and costs associated with deployments to a preliminary budget where we're not including either the direct labor cost or the reimbursement for that direct labor cost. So we have $3.8 million decrease just as a result of not really having an apples-to-apples comparison there. When we talk about labor, you'll see that the labor expenses are also lower in 17-18 relative to 16-17 for that very same reason. So when we adjust for that difference in how we treat deployment revenue, the net increase in general fund revenue is about $10.5 million. Added to the general fund revenue, that $189 million in general fund revenue, is the net IGT revenue that gets transferred into the general fund. That's about $5.8 million. That's a slight decrease, about $100,000 relative to this year. So turning to look at expenses, total general fund expenses are about $192 million. You can see that almost 86% of that relates to labor expenses, about 12.7% from services and supplies, and then a smaller amount from taxes, licenses, assessments, and contributions. So looking at those general fund labor costs, the 17-18 preliminary budget includes $164 million in labor expenses. That's up $6.7 million compared to fiscal year 16-17. When we make that same adjustment here for deployment expenses, so back those out of the 16-17 number to compare to 17-18, the increase is $9.9 million, or about 6.4%. Some of the reasons for that change are the scheduled salary increases that we have. So that combined with the increased payments, increased pension payments related to the unfunded liability really account for the majority of the increase. So we have about $4.5 million that's coming from salary increases, and overall about $3.4 million related to pension payments. There are smaller increases resulting from assumptions that we're making about medical premiums increasing in January. So those change on a calendar year basis, and we don't know what they will be at this point. But that's something that we typically refine at final budget when we have more information. But we are assuming a 7% increase, which is just a standard actuarial assumption. We have some increased holiday pay, which is really due to the timing of payments and how they happened in 16-17, increase resulting from additional filled positions and a small amount for new position requests. We see, particularly the increase for additional filled positions, we see offset by a reduction in overtime. So the 17-18 budget reflects a $3.6 million reduction in callback overtime. That's really resulting from having additional the assumption that we would have additional filled line positions. And then we also have a $700,000 reduction in shift overtime. Yes, Director
The
Orzella.
reference to the $700,000 reduction in shift overtime, that reduction came about as a result of what?
Really as a result, I think, of identifying needs and what the programs would be required in 17-18 compared to 16-17, and an evaluation of how that time has been used in 16-17.
Okay. So it's not a decrease in need level, but rather a refinement of understanding our process?
I think so. I think understanding how that expense is budgeted for and how it will be used. It's something that we do intend to track more closely going forward so that we can ensure that our budget and our actual expenses are in line there. I mean, I think that's a process that we've been going through with a lot of different categories of expenses, and I think that was an opportunity that we identified this year for sort of further scrutiny.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, so turning to look at general fund service and supplies expenses. The service and supplies budget totals $24.3 million. That's about a $1 million increase compared to this year. Most of that results from the assumption that we would have 12 months of the contract for ambulance service in 17-18 versus only 7 months in 16-17. There were various other smaller increases for training, building services, fuel, safety, and clothing supplies. Those were largely offset by reductions that resulted from one-time expenditures that we had in fiscal year 16-17 for equipment and election services that are not included in the 17-18 budget. And then looking at the final and smallest category of general fund expenses, our debt service assessments and contributions budget totals about $3.1 million. That's essentially unchanged from fiscal year 16-17. The largest component of that is about $1.8 million that we pay to the county for their administration and collection of property taxes on our behalf. And then that expense category also includes general fund debt service payments that total about $900,000. And you can see how those break out on this slide. So as I mentioned earlier, after revenues and expenses, we have to take a look at the transfers. So some of these we've already talked about, but just to kind of recap, the net transfers that are coming into the general fund total $1.5 million, and that's two that are going out, offset by a larger one that's coming in. So the $3.6 million transfer that's going to the Capital Facilities Fund is actually a decrease compared to 16-17, about a $1.3 million reduction in that funding requirement. I'll talk about where the $3.6 million comes from on the next slide. And then we have a $7 million transfer that's going to the leased $700,000 transfer that's going to the leased properties fund. And that we talked about a little bit. We'll also talk about that in more detail in just a moment. And then we have that $5.8 million net transfer that's coming in from the IGT fund, as we already discussed. So looking at the Capital Facilities Fund, and this is really the fund where we account for all of the capital purchases and the financing proceeds and the debt service that needs to be paid on that financing. If you look at that preliminary FY 17-18 column, you'll see that total revenue in that fund is about $4.9 million. And then if you look at total expenses, it's about $8.4 million. So the difference between those two is the $3.6 million that needs to come from the general fund to the Capital Facilities Fund. And just kind of explain how that works a little bit more. So we have this net funding requirement of $3.6 million. And that's really because there's $4.2 million of capital outlay, so actual expenditures that we're going to be making in 17-18. That's offset by $4.1 million in financing proceeds. So what we're saying is we're going to buy $4.2 million worth of stuff, and we're going to borrow money to pay for almost all of that. About $4.1 million of those expenditures would be financed. We're financing it over a 5-year period and assuming an interest rate of about 2%. So that financing and prior financings result in debt service requirements. So those are payments that need to be made over that 5-year period or whatever the term of the financing was. The debt service requirement in fiscal year 17-18 is $4.2 million. About $400,000 of that is relating to capital purchases that would occur in 17-18. So the rest of it, the $3.8 million, is a result of prior year financings and prior year purchases. So it's just payments on those prior financings. We also have in 17-18, we're reflecting revenue in this fund of about $800,000 assumed from the sale of property. So that's serving to offset the amount that needs to come in from the general fund. And then just some more detail on the capital purchases that are included in that $4.2 million of capital outlay. These are the major ones. We have a hazmat truck for $1 million, 3 ambulances for $600,000, 3 Type 6 engines for $600,000, and then an air rig for $600,000. So those are the major purchases. There's some other ones that total to that $4.2 million of capital outlay. Looking at the grant fund, so the The grant fund is used to account for the expenditures and revenue associated with the approved grants that we have. There are 2 approved grants that are reflected in fiscal year 17-18, totaling grant revenue of about $1.4 million. Those 2 grants are, we have the continuation of the SAFER grant that's funding 9 firefighter positions. So you can see that's reflected in the labor cost of about $1.2 million. And then we also have a separate grant, which is the $170,000 that, for the Homeland Security Grant Program for the Zinfandel training props. So those are the 2 grants that are reflected in 17-18. You can see that they're both 100% funded, so there's no required matching share from the district, no impact to the general fund as a result of those grants. Yes, question, Director Orzelli.
With regard to those grants, the reporting requirements and maintenance requirements that those grants hold, those are paid for out of the general fund. Is that right?
That is correct. I mean, I think we have the ability to recover any extraordinary administrative expenses, but we do essentially fund staff time out of the general fund.
Oh, so within these grants, we could recover.
If there were direct costs that were incurred.
I
yes.
see. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so now looking at the leased properties fund. So we talked a little bit about this already. Again, the major assumption here is that the first floor of this building would be leased during fiscal year 17-18, so it's been vacant since January. So we're assuming both in the revenue number and the expenditure number, impacts of that space being leased. So when you look at total revenues going from 16-17 to 17-18, you do see that we're projecting an increase in revenue as a result of additional lease payments. But obviously that is more than offset by the increase that you see in expenditures. If you look at the services and supplies line, those expenses are increasing by about $1.7 million, and that's almost entirely resulting from, an assumption that we would need to do tenant improvements on the first floor associated with that lease. Comparing the revenue line and the expenditure line, you can see that there's $1.3 million more in expenditures than revenue. About half of, 1.4 million more in expenditures than revenue, looking at that middle column there. About half of that would actually be funded from reserves that are already existing within the leased properties fund. So these are not general fund reserves, it's just the beginning balance of that leased properties fund, which has resulted from, lease revenue in excess of expenditures in prior years. So that $767,000 number you see on the bottom, that's how much funding is coming from the leased properties fund. And the difference between what's in there and what's needed is the $669,000 that would come from general fund reserves. So a little bit less than half of the total deficit in the leased properties fund. And that actually concludes my presentation. I think we've covered all of the funds, but I'd be happy to take any questions or clarify anything that you may want to discuss.
Well, it's not that I have questions. I just wanted to compliment you on the quality of this report. As I read through it, questions would come up, and invariably they would show up as I went forward in it. And I know how difficult it is to put together good reports. I've never actually done a good one myself, but I've read about them. And so I compliment you and your staff for the work.
Well, I appreciate that. You actually just reminded me of something I completely neglected to do, which was to thank everyone, because as I'm sure you know, that this process, not only does it take a lot of people in finance, but it's really everyone across the district, command staff, administrative specialists, budget officers, everyone who's sort of representing the needs of their division and helping to explain those. So those narratives that you see in that report, those all come from the divisions, and it really is truly a team effort to pull this together. So I appreciate your comments, and I would like to reflect them back out to everyone else who really deserves the credit.
That was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks.
There's no action required. The next meeting is June 22nd, to be determined here. All right, and that concludes the meeting.
Meeting? Oh, Joe weren't.